Okay, this is the second part of Chapter 7, and then we'll finish with Chapter 8. We left off with how they were expanding into the West with the Wilderness Road and the Land Acts. Towards the end of Washington's second term, he decided that this was going to be enough time for one person to spend in office, and he's going to set the precedent that people or presidents will stay in office for 2 terms, and really most presidents are going to follow that example until we get to the 1930s and 40s with FDR. But he's going to look back and on his second term, he's going to decide that it's time to step down. He'd helped to organize the national government with helping to secure the national credit, recovering the territory from Britain and Spain, stabilizing some of the frontier, seeing the admission of 3 new states, and drafted a farewell address that would become an example for policy for quite a while after that, and basically telling people to avoid division. He saw political parties as dangerous. He said to avoid permanent alliances with foreign nations. Permanent alliances he saw as dangerous. Temporary, however, during a time of war, something like that, that was a different story. But permanent alliances, he said, were a dangerous thing. And so that pretty much sets U.S. foreign policy for the next century or so after that. The election of 1796 was going to be Hamilton and Adams versus Jefferson and Burr. Hamilton begins a very enthusiastic campaign at Adams again in terms of, you know, the 2 Federalists that were fighting out for the nomination, Hamilton versus Adams. The outcome of the election, there's some division amongst the party, but Adams will be the one who is elected, and Jefferson will be vice president. Back then it was before they voted on a separate ticket. Basically, whoever was the runner-up as president became vice president. And so it's going to be Adams and Jefferson in 1796. Adams' years, he was very in between, I guess, Hamilton and Jefferson's policies. He was very much a Federalist, but he is going to have some definite challenges in his administration. With France, he had a hard time. There's an undeclared war between the U.S. and France after things like Jay's Treaty. The French were not excited about the new diplomats that they had sent over. We basically had undeclared naval warfare with them, and so Adams sends over delegates to talk to the French and try to negotiate with them. And they agreed to talk and negotiate, but only after the U.S. paid them $250,000 worth of a bribe in order to just negotiate. Adams is not happy about this. He resists a formal declaration of war, but makes sure that everybody knows that these delegates, he names them X, Y, and Z, were wanting a bribe just to talk to the United States, and so it really starts to further decrease any popularity that the French had at that point amongst Americans. For at home, as partisan division grew, Jefferson definitely helping to work at facilitating that whole division between the Federalists and the Democrat Republicans. Conflict with France is going to further divide these parties. The Republicans thought the purpose of the crisis was to provide Federalists with an excuse to put down any domestic opposition, using what was going on overseas to expand the powers they wanted to at home, basically. And one of those, or a couple examples of those, came with the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien and Sedition Acts were passed by Adams, and the very nature of most of them are things that violate many people's constitutional rights, and so there's a big outcry against them. Well, part of this bundle of laws that was passed was the Naturalization Act, lengthening the years required to live in the United States before you could apply for citizenship from 5 years to 14. The Alien Act, giving the president the ability to deport dangerous aliens. The Alien Enemies Act, the president could expel or imprison aliens at will during war. And the Sedition Act, saying basically you can't criticize the government in ways that laws that they were passing and write harmful stories against them. So they, there's a big cry against them because it's a violation of freedom of speech and due process laws with the Alien Acts and things like that. For Jefferson and Madison, they draft the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions in response to these Alien and Sedition Acts, basically trying to get states to have the right to judge violations of the Constitution by the federal government. It's a big states' rights push. It does not pass but is one of the first of many attempts for the states to push the states' rights over federal attempt. So Republicans and Federalists, there's lots of divisions between them, and as we get closer to the election of 1800, those divisions are going to come through with Jefferson being elected as president, and it's called the Revolution of 1800. It's a very peaceful exchange of political parties between the two. And right before Adams leaves office, he intended to make sure that the Federalists control the judiciary system, and so he provides vacancies and increase the number of attorneys, clerks, marshal, judgeships, and giving those positions to Federalists to make sure to flood the judicial branch with as many Federalists as possible. And we're going to talk about how the Judiciary Act came in right after Jefferson came into office. So hang on just a second. Okay, so going into Chapter 8. I'm just going to go right into it. For Chapter 8, looking at, it's basically going to pick up right where the other one left off, and that's going to be with Jefferson becoming president. There's a lot of optimism and a lot of movement. We talked a little bit about the westward expansion in the last chapter, in the last video. But there's a lot of movement with the population west of the Appalachian Mountains, from the south, from the Blue Ridge Mountains area, which is the Carolinas, from New England. A lot of people are heading farther and farther west. There's a lot of new business going in. Slavery is still a major part of the South, and a lot of that came from still growing and using tobacco. But also cotton is going to become much more popular and begin to just exponentially grow in terms of business and potential profit. And that, as well as tobacco, needed slaves, needed a large labor force, which became slaves, or was known as slaves at that point. And so it's going to be a big part of business, and called King Cotton, basically because of just how prominent it became and how influential it was, especially when you could negotiate with other countries. All right, so Jefferson takes over 1800. It was the first exchange of political parties in office, going from the Federalists to the Democrat Republicans. These political parties, as they were going to transfer, people were very nervous about it, and that's kind of how Jefferson wanted to approach, or why he wanted to approach it in such a simplistic manner. When he became president, he definitely changed his actions a little bit. He'd been very anti-Adams, which he was. The two don't speak for a very long time, but he's also going to want to come in, and he realizes that the way that the society is working at this point is very fragile, so he wants to be conscious of that. His inauguration said we were all Republicans, we were all Federalists, trying to basically say, I'm going to try to find some way of identifying with all sides, and we can work together, and trying to start off his administration with this spirit of cooperation between the two groups. He was very simplistic, very informal when he was president. His Secretary of State was James Madison. Secretary of the Treasury and Attorney General, Secretary of War, Postmaster. Many of them came from New England. And then when it came to the judicial branch, when we started talking about it a little bit just a minute ago, the midnight judges, as people called them, when Adams was about to leave office, right before he left office, he appointed all those new federal judges, and they called them his midnight judges, because right before he left office, when Jefferson came in, he told his Secretary of State, Madison, to stop giving out the commissions for these new judgeships. To get a position as a judge is kind of like your legal offer, your official offer to be a judge. And being a judge was a wonderful job to have. It was job security. The only way you could be removed from being a judge was if you had committed a crime, or you die, or you quit. So if you got one of these jobs, you definitely wanted to keep it. When he tells Madison to stop giving out the commissions, basically telling him to stop giving out these new jobs, Marbury was one of the ones that lost his commission or never received it. So he sues for getting his job, basically, and he goes to the Supreme Court. John Marshall had been appointed Supreme Court Chief Justice right as Adams was leaving. He was a Federalist. He's going to be Supreme Court Justice from 1801 to 1835. But John Marshall is going to declare that the Judiciary Act itself was unconstitutional, so therefore Marbury's job was not going to exist. So the argument of whether or not he was supposed to receive his commission was now irrelevant, because the job that was created for him was ultimately unconstitutional. It looked like he was siding with Jefferson at the time, which people, a little confused on that one. But what he was really doing was setting a precedent for the Supreme Court to have the ability to rule on the constitutionality of laws and acts. And it was something called judicial review, very important to know. So judicial review definitely increased the power of the Supreme Court. At the same time, extending this, furthering the ability of the Supreme Court to have a power of a check or balance over other parts of the government. So, I think I got ahead of myself. I just looked up at the screen. Going back to Jefferson, where he was in terms of foreign affairs with the Barbary Pirates. So it was very much domestic affairs, and that's fine because we'll skip the next slide. But going on to his foreign affairs with the Barbary Pirates, it's kind of in a similar situation with the X, Y, and Z affair. People wanting bribes, people wanting to be paid for, just what the U.S. saw as a reason they didn't want to pay. It wasn't unheard of in the Mediterranean for piracy to happen, and Tripoli, the leader of Tripoli, was demanding a bribe and basically had declared war, essentially, not officially in paper, but had cut down the U.S. flag at the embassy, which was seen as an act of war, and Jefferson sends troops to respond to them. We also dealt with foreign affairs with when the French took the Louisiana territory back from Spain. Spain being coerced, basically, that they just didn't have the ability to fight the French, and gave Louisiana back to the French. When they get Louisiana back, the U.S. is a little bit worried because Pinckney's Treaty, which had been signed with the Spanish, had given the U.S. to trade here on the Mississippi in New Orleans. Well, now that Spain was no longer in charge of this territory and the French were, that treaty is no longer useful. And so we were looking for a new treaty. So Jefferson sends Robert Livingston and James Monroe to go negotiate, wanted to get rights to trade New Orleans, Mississippi River, and then the French come back with another offer that says, how about you just buy the whole thing? So it offered to sell the entire Louisiana purchase for $15 million. The question on this was whether or not it was constitutional. Napoleon was ready to sell. He had too much going on. He had a rebellion in Haiti that was pulling his attention, and just could not maintain that North American territory. With the whole strict versus loose interpretation of the Constitution debate, because strict interpretation saw it as if it is not listed in the Constitution, then we do not have the right to that territory, or to that law, or to that act, or whatever it was that people were trying to do. Basically said, if you don't have it written in the Constitution, it's not allowed. Well, nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the government can buy land from another country. So strict interpretationists like Jefferson were having a hard time with this sale. If you go with loose interpretation, it just falls under that ability to kind of flex the Constitution as people saw fit as new issues came up, things like buying more territory. So the way that they are able to appease both sides is they are going to file it under the president's ability to make a treaty. It was the Treaty of Cession, 1803. And the U.S. gave France $15 million, and France gave the U.S. all the Louisiana territory. Lewis and Clark were commissioned to go and explore, to see if, what was there, to map, to come back with basically what was out there and the potential. Came back with a very positive report that's going to quickly inspire more traders, trappers, settlers to go farther west.